Well, as I was saying, I brought my pet dragon along for this conversation because I think there's just a wonderful pathos in that expression. He's a dragon, but he looks rather like a dog that feels as if he's done something wrong in that way dogs do, but they're not quite certain what. And I thought it was a pretty endearing expression for a dragon. I'm a great believer, incidentally, in dragons in general, in the sense that, uh, excuse me, they're they're a sound guide to life. That is, in feng shui, the rule is that you design an interior to flow.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of a mysticism of interior decor
Mm-hmm.
and design that involves achieving a certain flow, a pattern throughout the space. And the way to do this, apparently, in part, is to imagine that you're building and designing the interior for a dragon. A
Mm-hmm.
dragon, the Asian model, who's somewhat long and sinuous. And if a
Mm-hmm.
dragon can get around without knocking things over, then in all likelihood, you can as well.
It's good. Yeah. That puts me in mind of this quote that or this notion that I'd taken from Guy Davenport when he was writing about Shaker furniture, and he said Shakers designed chairs with the idea that an angel could sit in it. So there's a comparable energy there,
Yeah.
although dragon energy is a little different than angel energy, we'll say.
Yeah, as far as we know.
As far as we know.
As far as we know. I mean,
That's right.
the East Asian dragon, who's forever among the clouds, in a sense, might be just another manifestation of the same
Yeah.
angelic principle. You never know. So let's start in earnest. You're Peter O'Leary, poet, writer about poetry and other things. Uh, Critic, and you're even, if I'm right, you're Ronald Johnson's literary too, right?
Yes, I am.
So,
Yep.
well,
Yeah.
we should get around to talking about that a bit too, perhaps. But
Yeah.
how are you? How are
I've
you?
I'm I'm fine. I've been looking forward to talking with you in this format since you mentioned it a couple of months ago. So um yeah, I'm really glad to be here and looking at your dragon. And
Right. He's a good fellow, you know. So, so, um, I don't know. Let me do. I go through this sort of routine sometimes of
Mhm.
holding up volume. I have quite a few volumes of your work here, and no particular order. I guess well, there's this one that
That's a good
LE
one.
stands for.
Yeah.
Well, I would pronounce it luminous epinoea, but I
Mm.
take it you would say epinoia.
Yeah, that's for in terms of the source. I encountered it first in Elaine Pagel's her book about
Yeah.
the she was writing about the Apocryphon of John.
Right.
It's in the Beyond Belief. That's the volume.
Yes, yes. Well, as a matter of pronunciation, this is simply an old battle between those who cling to the outworn Erasmian orthodoxy and those who, how can I put it, nomizio otita Hellenica prepipanto na proferonte me dematico troppo. I think that
That's
Greek
about
should,
how I would have put it,
yeah, I
actually.
mean, I just think that Greek should always be pronounced in demotic fashion, but that's practically an ideological issue. So, so I'll forgive you your
I
Western captivity.
I appreciate it.
Um, watchfulness. As I
Wonderful. Yeah.
said, I'm not putting these in any particular order.
That was the first one. That's
Yeah,
the first book. Yeah.
but it can't be the first one in my pile because it's not the biggest. Phosphorescence of thought. I think one has to acknowledge that that's a title that I don't know if it's enviable or deplorable, but it's interesting. Phosphorescence of thought. Depth theology. These are all books of poetry. For those out there, the Earth is Best.
Good title.
Actually, I'm probably going to put you on the spot at some point and say, do you want to read a little bit of something of yours? The problem is you don't write.
Of course, I'd love to.
Short poems, so I hope you have one in mind something in mind that you. This not long ago, Sampo, which is sort of I don't know, it's a distillate of comments on mythic meditation on the Kalevala, Kalevala, depending on. I think it's Kalevala. I'm trying to remember where the accent goes. Forgive me, my Finnish is imperfect, but
I'm sure the Greeks will forgive you.
The Elias Lönnrot epic from, I guess the second edition was what, 1848, 1849, somewhere.
Yes.
And that's a very interesting one. And your most recent thing, The Hidden Eyes of Things, which I don't know what we're going to be talking about. Well, we can talk about all of them, but I would characterize you, I think, if I were asked to characterize you, as, I don't know, someone in the tradition of Orphic poetry, Vatic, Blakean, maybe a touch of various forms of symbolist movement. Not, not that one has to be categorized specifically, but you do write a lot about the sort of themes that interest those of us who are concerned for the intersection of art and religion,
yes,
art and theology, or the arts and I don't even want to put it precisely that way. Also, art and mythic consciousness, the relationship between consciousness and reality, the place of mind in nature, the lure of transcendence. We could go on all day. I could come up with.
I'm never going to have anyone else write jacket copy for me. I'll let you free associate. That's perfect.
I have formidable capacity for that too. I mean, especially after one or two glasses of wine, I'm willing just to sit in the corner mumbling free association, one phrase after another. But I mean, some of your work uses Gnostic imagery, for instance,
definitely
luminous epinea. Your most recent book. The most recent book of verse, again, I've already forgotten its title. I shouldn't set these things aside. The Hidden Eyes of Things uses the, I should say the planets in their traditional astrological aspects, rather like hosts the planets, not in terms of their Greco-Roman mythic foundations alone or as such. I mean, it's meditations on solar glory and on the jovial and on the Saturnine and so on and so forth. And I suppose I could sum up, if I tried, not that it's necessary, if I were trying to sum up what seems to engage you as a poet, it is a kind of project of re-enchantment or not that, a flight from disenchantment. All of this is fair. You seem to be nodding.
I'm appreciating that that's what you're encountering in the work, because that is largely what motivates me as I do what I do. So I think I think I was from an early sort of vocational age, which is to say, even back into my boyhood, I was really drawn to and committed to the visionary without really knowing that that's what it was that I was interested in. And as I've learned more, it's essentially worked as a kind of confirmation or validation of that path, in as much as it was chosen. So absolutely, I feel those things. I didn't know what was I wanted to be a poet. That's what I had in sort of in my mind, in my heart, when I was a young man. But I was also really drawn to studying, and I have an aptitude for it in some respects. And I wasn't sure what I wouldn't have been able to say when I wanted to study religion, for instance, why that in relation to poetry. But now looking back on that decision, and everything feels inevitable in hindsight, I feel like I was instinctively drawn to studying religion, because I needed to come up with a language for articulating this attraction to vision, visionary reality, mysticism in some respects, but especially a notion of poetry as the manifestation of vision in language. I wouldn't have been able to put it that way when I was a younger poet. But I think that's what drew me. You already mentioned Ronald Johnson. I think that's what drew me to him and his work. He's a classic visionary in the Blakean sense that you alluded to earlier. So yeah, that's really it. And it's not to say that I feel that poetry excludes other modalities, but I feel like that's the thing it does best. And I think it does it better than just about anything else. So if you can do it that way, do it. It's like, if you're going to make a chair, make it so that an angel can sit in it. Or if you're going to, design your apartment, make sure that the dragon can coil through the rooms.
Right. And there's an implicit, of course, invitation there to angels and dragons. So if you proceed that way, you're courting a response, I would think. I mean, you're hoping that you're not just casting psychologically particular oracles out into the void. You're actually trying to establish a language of communion.
Yes. Yeah, that's definitely the case. I just was involved in a little an online reading group with these two extraordinary poets. One of them is G.C. Waldrop, and the other is Tim Lilburn. G.C. Waldrop he belongs to an Old Order Brethren communion in Pennsylvania, and Tim Lilburn lives in Vancouver. And was, like, earlier in an earlier iteration, he was a Jesuit, and he's a visionary poet.
But how many iterations has he had, and how many editions?
At least more than that one. Although he taught, there's a I think I want to say it's a Dominican seminary that's in Saskatchewan, or maybe it's in Regina, which is called St. Peter's, I believe. And he was teaching there for many years, philosophy. Any case, we made our way through Dionysius's celestial hierarchy, and this was a term that we found ourselves coming back to again and again, was participation. The way in which the hierarchy is implicitly and explicitly participatory. So I think the relationship between communion and participation in that regard is valuable as a way of thinking about what I may or may not be doing in my work. Not much of this is conscious as I do the work. I think it's part of a kind of ambient consciousness, let's say, but it's definitely there. It's definitely,
well, I mean, the very language of participation would suggest as much.
Yeah.
Um, but this also, of course, puts you pretty firmly in the Romantic tradition of thinking about what you're doing with verse, which incidentally I approve of.
I'm not surprised to hear that.
Well, actually, come to think of it, I should mention you wrote an endorsement for a book of mine, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
For Roland.
No, Kanagaya.
Oh, Kanagaya. Okay, that's right. Okay. I don't know. I put out a book every other week, so I can't.
I've got a stack of them, though. My Kanagaya is down in the basement. I put all your books nearby. They're right here, just so I can authenticate that I too have a pile.
Yeah, that's a minor selection. Sure.
I know. That's right. That's right. It's not all of the tomes.
But I mean, this of course, this understanding of the task of poetry. Just of late, but I talked. Of course, you're acquainted with Henry Weinfield, and I talked to him lately, and I've had some other conversations that also touch on the matter, and it's very much the case, I think, that a genuinely sane understanding of what a poet is doing, or the only purpose in being a poet, if you don't understand it merely as a form of distraction, is this act of participation in which, definitely as inflected through your private sensibility, but nonetheless in an earnest and even pious attempt to be in communion with something greater than yourself, you're trying to let the world and in its depths come to utterance through you. And there's the participation isn't just that you're drawing from those depths, but in a sense, you become a vehicle by which the world knows itself in a different mode. Now, I mean, at least that's part of the Romantic myth of the poet, is that you know how, of course, especially in the second phase, British Romanticism, but also even in its German form, the inversion of the manic description of the poet from Plato. What becomes at first in Plato is an expression of trepidation at the wildness and the sort of antinomian mysticism that a poet can be prey to if he falls under the influence of questionable daemonian influences. Let's put it that way.
Right. Yes.
In the Romantic tradition, becomes a kind of glorification in the poet's unique access to some of the mystery of I mean, a lot of this can be self-aggrandizing, of course.
Oh yeah.
So,
yes, and I'm not immune to that in any way whatsoever. I'll readily admit.
We'll talk about that.
Well, I have. That's great. I will. I'll confess. I have an image that has been growing and becoming richer over time as a result of teaching material, all kinds of material, but including Romantic material. And I'm convinced that, at least in the Western poetic imagination, that it was crucial when it was a crucial and really dynamic transition that happened when the vertical relationship with the divine, with inspiration, was laterally shifted from, let's say, God in Milton, for instance, and even in Blake, to the natural world. I think it was really consequential because it enabled something unexpected and even more consequential to happen, which is that the orientation, the vertical orientation, went from outwards and upwards to something downwards and inwards, so that by the time the moderns are writing poetry, their sense of inspiration is entirely being drawn from the earth, drawn from within themselves, psychologically or otherwise. And it reinscribes, in a sense, how something like allegory, which was so instrumental or has been so instrumental in poetry writing, it reinscribed how allegory would start to function, where, as T.S. Eliot puts it in his monograph on Dante, he says allegory is clear visual images. That's what it is. That's all you need to worry about with allegory. But by the time you move into the 20th century, it becomes something that you fret about more, and kind of gets put to the side in order to, for poets to really focus on what they're seeing. And I think it took a while for poets, including poets like Ronald Johnson, to become more emphatic about restoring a certain kind of religious, capital V, visionary quality to clear visual images, what you're seeing. And so I relate that in terms of the kind of depiction you just provided, going back to Plato and moving up through, let's say, even into the present, that, there's always been a strain, an initiatic strain in poetry, which is certainly participatory, but it also has a kind of a quality of, if not a just a whiff of exclusivity, or at least exclusion, which can be off-putting to, those who wish to democratize inspiration and otherwise. I have a cat who loves to visit Zoom. That's her.
That's all right.
She understands that Zoom was devised for cats, for them to.
The internet was devised for cats, I believe.
The internet, it's true.
I think it is primarily for cat videos, and then a few other things like access to libraries
but secondary to the cat videos.
Absolutely. Yeah, pretty much. That's what keeps the whole machine driving.
Yeah, I'm a believer in that. And so this initiatic strain that I just alluded to, which I believe is minor in terms of a major strain that tends to dominate, which I can characterize if you're curious. But this minor initiatic strain, it really is petitionary. It involves it has a devoted quality to it, an erotic quality, eros as related to logos, that is to say, and it involves a kind of spirit of romance, as Rapound put it in his book of that title, which is to say, this you're appealing to these powers, and you're recognizing them through a lineage which culminates in living masters, and you petition to those masters to start instructing you in their way, and it's in that sense it's vital. And I feel that I had the good fortune, might even say grace, to not have had any clue or idea whatsoever when I was a young poet as to what I was or should do. But I happened to make contact with Ronald Johnson, and he gave me the greatest possible gift to my petition, which is that he took it seriously. He didn't. He took it for what it was, which is, I actually wrote to him in the first letter that I sent to him. What should I do? What should I do to be a poet, to keep moving forward?
Well, of course, we're just since you mentioned the great gray ghost of Eliot.
Yes. Yeah.
It's interesting, of course, is that there was the critical orthodoxy. I mean, there are always 9 or 10 critical orthodoxies operative at any moment.
Yeah.
The one that he established, that when I was young and impressionable, was a kind of disdain for the Romantic period,
Yeah.
German and English, and a retreat to the secure, metaphysical, supposedly secure, because there was a proper proportion between image and idea, image and emotion. There was what's the correlative? So I've already forgotten.
The objective correlative.
The objective correlative.
That's right. Correct. Yes. Right.
And so we were supposed to, and I'm more, I mean, I love the metaphysicals. I mean, Henry Vaughan, especially.
Me too.
Herbert and all these are, but we were supposed to praise them, despise, if not despise, at least regret the age of wit. The Dryden through Pope was to be, and in a sense, look down on the Romantics as having failed to find that objective correlative and having surrendered themselves simply to an oceanic sense of transcendence without rigor. Now, I find all these divisions now, a bit absurd, but I actually had to rediscover the German and English Romantics, and to my mind, it's absurd to pose, say, Hodenine over against Henry Vaughan, or to pose Keats over. In fact, all of them in different ways were engaged both in the mysteries of the transcendent. I mean, these are all poets that are in some sense, even Shelley, who thinks he's an atheist, but who isn't.
Exactly. No, I have the same opinion.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, the life force. I mean, the truth is, atheism is a word, is a term embraced by people who start from a fairly childish notion of what's meant by the word God. I mean, the new atheists,
yes,
are basically just inverted fundamentalists, and it's impossible to take Shelley seriously on the necessity of atheism, because it turns out that, of course, what he means is the necessity of not worshiping a demiurge. I mean, which is pretty universally acknowledged by everyone, that it's better not to adore a fantasy tyrant. But then it's just that the notion of poetry that Eliot wanted to, and I say as an admirer of Eliot, at least the early Eliot. I think he kind of topped out before he got to the four quartets. I tend to think the four quartets are overrated, but not horrible. I just think that the early Eliot is a much livelier and interesting poet. Probably up through the Hollow Man,
more fraught, that's for sure.
Well, yeah, maybe that's part of it. Is that the nervous breakdowns kept coming to the surface? The wasteland is also a pathology, a sort of psychopathology being unfolded. The fragments that he's shoring against his ruin are in parts fragments of his own psychological state. I think we all know. The dreadful first marriage, which was bad from both sides.
Yeah, it was.
But the thing is, of course, that you had this sort of priestly notion of the poet as opposed to the prophetic notion.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, that's about as convincing as the artificial division between priestly and prophetic in Israelitic religion. It's more a critical division than it is something that corresponds to actual practice. The real piety that, just as the piety of Israel was at once priestly and prophetic, so it is that that both these strains, all these strains, are present in the metaphysicals and in the romantics both, and this sort of strange need to create a critical distance from romanticism because it was the wrong kind of language of transcendence.
Yeah.
Excuse the ringing of my phone. I have the phone off, but unfortunately, I don't know how to turn off its connection to my computer. So
Perfect. I
so
wouldn't have it any other way. Yeah.
yeah, no, I believe in authenticity. Actually, I don't. Well, I'm with the Adorno on that. The jargon of authenticity is frequently pernicious, but I'm for unguarded moments. But let me ask you this. Now, of course, we're talking about you, which is the second most interesting topic that we could be talking about today.
Yes.
We're talking about you. When did you? I mean, there is obviously a fascination with Gnostic imagery.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. You know why? Can you characterize it? Because I'm fascinated with Gnostic imagery for any number of reasons. Both,
yes, which I think I would love to hear about. So I'm hoping we can share.
We can get to that, but I mean, it has with me, it's complicated because it's also has to do with certain attempts to reconstruct the divisions and concords of the early church and the sects of the time, and trying to understand the language, how the language of the New Testament. I mean, so I have scholarly concerns that have to do with my work in translation. And,
yes,
but I have a deeper interest in that for other reasons. So, but it will start with you, and then we'll move on to the more interesting me. No, we'll start with you. When did you? I mean, first of all, when were you aware of this interest, and
I
how do you
think
characterize it?
I think it began. So there are two. Let's say there are two pathways, two vectors. Okay, the first one is intellectual. The first one is intellectual and even spiritual in its way, which is really exposure to the material. Which, I grew up in a bubble of American Catholicism, of the upper Midwest variety, where on the block that I grew up on, the things that distinguish the people living on the block was which parish they went to, so I just had no idea or awareness whatsoever of anything outside of the gift of shredded wheat catechism that I experienced in the 1970s and into the early 80s, let's say. So when I got to when I started studying, especially when I was in the divinity school at the University of Chicago, there was just tremendous exposure to things. And the more that exposure, the more I was exposed, the more interesting it became. So when I was a first year student there, I took a course with a scholar named Arthur Droge, and he taught a class called Paul, Luke, and the Invention of Christianity. And it was just, one scale after the other falling from my eyes in terms of origins. I just didn't know anything about it. And then as that trajectory, as that path advanced, I became aware that there were other poets, even as I was a younger poet, other poets who were similarly interested and invested. And one of them is a great visionary American poet named Joseph Donahue. And Donahue goes by Joe, and he's a friend, so that's how I'll refer to him. And Joe once said, actually, we were talking about Karen King's book on Gnosticism, which, in which she just kind of she tries to complete. I mean, in a way that is consistently fascinating, degrade the category of Gnosticism, at least in terms of how we regard it. And Joe's response to it is, I respect what she's doing. He said, but the myth is so beautiful, it must be true. And that has tended to be, in a kind of intellectual and creative way, how I relate to it. But secondarily, and I'll mention this briefly because I want to hear what you have to say. When I was younger, I had a very close friend growing up in the east side of Detroit and in its suburb of Grosse Pointe Park. That's where I did most of my growing up. And one of my friends was, and I'm not making this up or editing it for popular consumption. His name was Harry Potter, and Harry was the person that I played Dungeons and Dragons with, and he had invented this elaborate inner world, which he called the Intermundia. And we
from the Epicureans, of course.
Yes, of course.
The Metacosmia.
And Harry's whole, and this is this like multi-volume history and cosmology of the Intermundia that he undertook. And it included all kinds of Gnostic lore. And so it was with Harry that I was first tempted by the mysterious fruits of that heresy. And so it's back in there in the same way that fantasy literature is so important to me. It's like they belong in the same category. And that, I think, is why, that's why Luminous, I'm going to call it epinoia, just because I'm an ignorant fool.
But no, look. I mean, the barbarians will be barbarians. You must simply learn to enchant them with little gifts. Like the Chinese emperor sending gifts of glass beads to the Huns in the hope that this would quell their martial instincts. They'd be,
Right.
So I'll let you say
you'll let it slide. Well, that I mean, that really is a kind of, for me, it's a convergence of those two paths. There's this intellectual and creative path, but then there's this one that's more of a kind of psycho-emotional, coming of age, kind of developmental one, and they converge for me. So the Gnostic material is interesting, and I'll add this as a footnote because I think this will amuse you. As would happen with somebody named Harry Potter, with whom I'd fallen out of touch after a certain period. You can't find Harry Potter on the internet. It's just not possible.
No.
So
not the one you're looking for. No,
not the one I'm looking for. But because I was living in Vienna with my wife in 1997 and 1998. She was doing her dissertation research, and I was writing my dissertation while we were there, and I kept hearing about Harry Potter the Wizard, and I thought, wow, how does everybody know about Harry? Like, what happened? How is it that the Viennese are whispering about him? And then I realized, and I saw him not long after we returned, and I asked him, what do you think about this Harry Potter stuff? And he said, it's the worst. Imagine your secret wish, exposed to the world.
I've often, the novelist Nicholas Shakespeare. For God's sake, man. Change the name.
Change the name.
I mean, yes, it's your family name, and you may actually be related to the real Shakespeare. But I mean, do you really want, every time your name is mentioned, every time someone says you're a writer, do you want that comparison to be drawn? I mean, it's like being named God.
Right. That's
okay.
Right.
Well, I know a better one.
That's true. There was a basketball player in the want to say it was in the 90s, who played for Providence College, if I'm correct, whose name was Sham God. That was his name. That's like a Gnostic character, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, as filtered through Charles Bukowski. Yeah.
Maybe. So this is the little footnote. As I said, I think it might amuse you. As it happens, I did get it. Harry and I are back in touch, and it was when I received an invitation to come to his ordination. So he's a Catholic priest in the Archdiocese of Kalamazoo, and my younger brother, and I are.
And I have to wonder, is that the fate of many people who grow up playing Dungeons and Dragons?
Yeah, well, he's very well suited in that regard. But we, my younger brother is arranging for us to get together sometime soon. We'll drive over to Kalamazoo from Chicago, and apparently Harry made sure to tell my brother Michael. He said, he says, I've always been just a little worried about Peter and his attraction to the archons. So be careful. He urged caution.
Well,
my brother.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's good that he's concerned. Well, the thing about, if I had to characterize my interest, which gone through phases, in Gnostics, it comes from two ends, in a sense, two sources. One is a fascination with the early centuries. Late antiquity is a field. It's a time I know well. I mean, let's admit it, most Christians have something of a Hollywood concept of the early centuries of Christianity, right?
Definitely.
There was the Roman Empire, the Gentile world, and alongside this Gentile world was the colonized people of Judea and of Galilee. And the way they lived was, as far as we know, somewhere our characterization of the Judaism of the time is sort of a conflation of the late prophetic religion of Israel and later rabbinic Judaism. We're aware that there were these groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes. We know very little about them, but most Christians are largely unacquainted with the Second Temple Judaism of late, and they're certainly not aware of the degree to which Greco-Roman antiquity was not divided into hermetically sealed national identities, and that Judaism was not in any way a sort of a recusant from Greco-Roman culture, and that for 3 centuries there'd been an easy intellectual and spiritual commerce between what we think of as the pagan and the Jewish worlds. And then there came along Christianity, which is a sort of, in its origins, was an inchoate form of either Protestantism or Catholicism.
Right, exactly.
Maybe Orthodoxy if you come from my wing, but the truth is, and the degree to which they know anything about Gnosticism, this is inflected either through the polemics,
yes,
of people who really know nothing about the period. I can tell you all sorts of amusing stories about that, but and also, of course, there's this curiosity of how the texts from Nag Hammadi and elsewhere were translated, which is that without exception, when they were translated, and this was in part really a kind of decision, ideological decision on the part of the Protestant scholars chiefly responsible for the early generations of Gnostic scholarship, in order to create a sense of a radically different tradition is that the exotic terminology tended to be more or less transliterated rather than translated. So, so everyone's aware, of course, the Gnostic world is full of these things called archons, and that divides humanity into the pneumatiki and the psychiki and the somatiki. Whereas, of course, you find none of that in mainstream Christianity. Well, of course, it's nothing but the same terminology that you find in the New Testament. Although the traditional translations there, we don't write pneumatiki, we write spiritual men. We don't speak of the archons, we speak of the rulers.
Rulers, right.
And we've so retrofitted the world of the New Testament to our later picture of Christianity that we can't understand Gnosticism at all, to the degree that category is even useful, as anything other than have willfully perverse departures from an orthodoxy that was established, rather than, as was really the case, sects that were expanding upon, amplifying upon, or following what they took to be actual deliverances of the texts. So, and of course, as you know, the actual theology of the Apostle Paul is precisely, in many respects, the sort of thing that, say, let's say traditionalist, manualist, Thomist, to one of my favorite categories.
I know you have there's a real place in your heart for them.
I have a special set of feelings about them. Let's put it that way. To me, they exemplify, you see, unlike Calvinists, they have their system, and they believe in the Protestant picture of the early Christian world, which we know is a 16th century fable. It's not true. And that's just, but they are the difference with the Thomists is the sort of studiousness with which they pursue total ignorance of the tradition outside their own faction. It's frightening. I mean, I won't name names. You already know the names of many of the people I have in mind. But the most fascinating thing about debates with them is you can cite all the scholarship in the world, and if, as is the case with me, you actually know the period you're talking about and the languages and the texts, it doesn't matter. There's a total lack of any intellectual curiosity there. They've got the system, and they don't want to be told otherwise. And much of
it's like originalism.
Well, I think you and I and people who are aware of what the late antique religious world was like, and what was going on in Second Temple Judaism, and what sort of language was being picked up by Paul, and what he's actually explicitly saying in the text, he would be considered a heretic, according to many. He would be. I mean, first of all, they're the aporias to begin with. The fact that Paul clearly has no concept of an eternal hell. He may be an annihilationist as regards the wicked, or he may be a universalist, since he uses some pretty pregnant universalist formulae. But he most certainly didn't have any notion, the later notion of hell as an actual state of perpetual torment. He doesn't mention the empty tomb when he gives the resurrection, when he talks in 1 Corinthians 15 about the proof of the resurrection. And that does raise questions, because then he goes on to give you a metaphysics of the resurrection body, which explicitly, while affirming that it consists in being given eternal life in an indestructible spiritual body. It's a real body, it's corporeal reality. He explicitly rejects the notion that this is a resurrection of the flesh and blood. And so right there you have he's already not working within what later orthodoxy, which would actually speak of the resurrection of the flesh. To Paul, that would be a meaningless category. But when you get beyond that, when you really look into his theology, the degree to which so much of the tradition on justification by
Right.
faith is based on misreadings. It's based on a misunderstanding of how to translate the word ta erga, which, especially with the article,
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, is generally understood as a reference to religious works of, and he's clear about works of the law. Divisions of grace and nature unknown to him. I mean, that it comes from a misreading, a later misreading of Romans, one verse in Romans 11,
Hmm.
and a few other things. What really concerned Paul, I mean, in fact, the whole Romans 9 through 11, which is, for this tradition all about predilective election, is obviously just the opposite. It's about as universalist a statement as possible, that God is providentially bringing all, both the Gentiles and Jews, into the kingdom. But what are the real religious concerns of Paul? There are mutinous spiritual powers, angels,
Yeah.
bad angels, principalities, powers, archons. The archons rule this world. In Galatians, even, says that the law of Moses is imperfect because, it wasn't written by God. It was written and ordained by angels. And we know how chancy the angels can be. They're and how much of his language has to do with, in fact, he seems to conflate resurrection and ascent as ascent through the planetary spheres.
Right.
For him, when he talks about neither height nor depth, neither powers nor principalities, or I should be better at quoting these things, but I wasn't raised Southern Baptist. But I've actually read them, so I wasn't raised Thomist either. So that he literally means there are no obstructions in the heavens above now that can prevent, because all of these powers on high have been subdued by Christ, who has even gone into the underworld and subdued the powers there, so that ultimately all will be handed over to the Father. Okay. Now, we don't have the radical dualism that is attributed to certain of the Gnostic sects, and that clearly was taught by, I think, certain Sethian schools and certain others, though not.
Yeah.
I have my doubts, at least about developed Valentinianism now. There are just so many, and the difference between Eastern and Western there's so many ambiguities. This is why I say the very notion of Gnosticism is problematic. But for me, part of the fascination, I'm sorry to take so long to say this.
Oh, because this is what I'm here for. I want to hear this.
Well, yes, so just be silent and listen. I'm glad you say that, but I mean, the truth is, part of it's trying to reconstruct an intelligent understanding of what the actual theological concerns of Paul, John, John's Gospel, which is very much about the one from above descending through the planetary spheres to overthrow the archon of this world, as he calls it, to judge him, and the sort of immanentizing of the whole eschatological language. And this is true throughout the New Testament, of course, that the clear notion of a future judgment, or of a judgment that is passing through the spheres, it tends to be at times not clearly distinguished, at times conflated. Different authors see this in different ways. The language that we think is so clear and precise is actually more a kind of visionary, symbolic language, which points towards a reality that really can't be reduced to a set of formulae. That's one engine. On the other hand, though, I'm fascinated with the mythos of Gnosticism in the modern age, and the degree to which it's been right, but in all the ways that those who say there's been a Gnostic return are wrong about. I mean, you know perfectly well that the term Gnostic is often used in an opprobrious and polemical way that makes no sense.
Definitely. It does. One of the things I find really really interesting, because I teach a course on Gnosticism at the School of the Art Institute here in Chicago, And the art students, they don't require any padding or any qualification. They're interested in the mythos, as you just put it, and they see it everywhere. And in fact, it informs a lot of the media that they're already actively engaging. So, for instance, within the Japanese anime tradition, Gnostic material is it's constantly iterated and reiterated.
I mean, it's to be honest, I mean, it pervades how gotten to the point where the genre of the science fiction Gnostic allegory, it has become almost trite. I mean, it's how many stories about living in a virtual reality? I mean, the Matrix trilogy, which wasn't very good, but nonetheless, it's a straight. And then there were, and of course, the two films by the same writer during Gattaca and The Truman Show, which are straightforward and conscious Gnostic stories that just borrow directly from the texts. But it's amazing to me how often the myth, or Dark City, another
Dark City, definitely
again, not necessarily a great film, but
it's there.
Inception
for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it pervades the kind of conspiratorial political imagination too. You definitely see in QAnon, for instance, it's just a kind of debauched,
step back,
debauched Gnosticism.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But I think also what doesn't interest me is the sort of the people who think that what is particularly. I'll give you an example. In fact, I gave this as an example in a series of articles I wrote for my Substack newsletter. And they appeared probably more than a year ago now. But I sort of see this column by Rod Dreher.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry to curse, but there's a column by Rod Dreher. Now, okay, not the sharpest tool in the cupboard. I think we're going to agree with. At least he now lives in Hungary and is so credulous that he believes that Viktor Orban is a champion of Christianity. Which,
oh boy.
Well, it gives you a sense of just how pliable the term Christianity is. But he wrote this silly thing about how people who seek to upload themselves onto a digital platform are repeating the Gnostic heresy, and that of course Christianity is about the redemption of the flesh, not its rejection. Which again would have come as a great surprise to the Apostle Paul, who's pretty clear that it's about the rejection.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Of the flesh.
Sarke.
Sarks.
Yeah.
But I mean, they'll tell you that by sarks he means sinful human nature.
It's like I think
it's pretty clear what he means. He's pretty clear what he means. He tells you pretty much that this is an animal, a psychical body that cannot enter into eternity, cannot inherit the kingdom, flesh and blood. Mm. The outer man, the body, the flesh, strives against the spirit, the inner man that seeks God. He's a good dualist in that regard.
Right.
But it was absurd, of course, because of course you can understand nothing about Gnosticism of the early centuries if you actually believe that what they longed for was something akin to being imprisoned forever in a virtual world of your own devising.
Yeah.
I mean, the passion to find the truth of things, the Father above in whom, or else, the father or forefather, no matter how grave the perils that separate you from the true God are, is the guiding passion.
That's it. Exactly.
And why has that been revived in the modern age? Why is and again, not like Eric Voegelin misused the term. There's a book by was it Edward Feser, believe it or not, critical race theory, which he understands about as well as he understands astrophysics. But anything is an opportunity just to be not woke.
Yeah.
But
I have a question for you, David.
He speaks of it not as Gnosticism because of this Vogelinian sense, and it has it's just absolute gibberish. If you want to know, and anyway, but my question to you, and I have an answer, I think. I mean, one answer, many, is why this mythos, almost in some cases consciously, say like the Truman Show,
Yeah.
but in other cases quite unconsciously recurs now again and again and again. It's becoming, in a sense, a sort of pervasive mythos.
Yeah.
Not a flight from the flesh, but a flight from illusion, the sense that we're trapped in an illusion that can only be transcended if we wake up from the stupor of cooperation with the false reality in which we find ourselves imprisoned.
Yes. Yeah. When I teach the material, we spend half the semester or more on the ancient material, and then we move into reading novels and
Voyage to Arcturus.
Yeah. Well, actually, the focal point is Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, which is
well, I wish he really were more Gnostic than he is. He's just he's got the Canoma. There's just no Pleroma.
There's not. Yeah, that's exactly right. But that actually ends up being useful enough in the sense that I think one of the attractions of the mythos remains the conviction in, if not just anxiety about evil, and trying to generate narrative structures for relating to that anxiety or conviction, such as it might be. So I think the reason that the story, the mythos, continues to be revived, resuscitated, why it won't go away. There's no amount that a Rod Dreher or somebody else can say to cause it to go away, is that there is this, let's call it a kind of creative disposition. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's an articulation of the actual, but there's this creative agitation that responds to this notion, as Joe Donahue said, that the myth is too beautiful not to be true. There's something about the notion that you are struggling through some sort of imprisonment or this sort of sleep state, and that you can be either set free from it, liberated, or woken up. It's very attractive, artistically and otherwise.
I would also point out that again, this is one of the false divisions that the old scholarship used to draw between supposedly Gnosticism as a system, which never actually existed as a system. I mean, we're talking
yeah.
And
that's the Karen King argument.
Orthodoxy, which of course didn't exist in the early centuries. I mean, the early Christians believed a great many different things.
Yes,
and of course, it was only when they were officially tolerated by the empire that they began to discovering how great the differences in their beliefs were. Always had been, but we have it there in John. We used to be told, you can see this in Bauer, who of course is the first of many responsible in the 18th century for creating the false impression that somehow the early Gnostics had a mythos that was coherent with that of with various forms of German idealism. Which, to my mind, is just the opposite of true. I mean, it's if anything, the Gnostic mythos has a much more austere, sense of the relationship of creation to God, and this notion that there was a fall in the Godhead is just a misunderstanding. It's the fall of the pleroma is like the fall of the angels for Jewish and Christian, especially Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. But already we were told that Gnosticism is a system of salvation by knowledge rather than faith or things like and these are again just divisions that are false. We know that these schools put a great emphasis on belief and on sacramental mediation and on knowing the truth, and that the Christians too. I thought they had a true gnosis, and this is especially evident in, say, the schools of Asia Minor that you see reflected in the Gospel of John, the degree to which there are those who are awake and those who are not. I mean, these are those who see Jesus for who he is, and they're already, in a sense, liberated. And those who do not, and they're still the children of the archon of this world.
Right.
And there's this light and darkness as the light of vision, of knowledge, as much as anything else. Now, if you're going to teach Gnostic fiction, though, there's one novel that is de rigueur. Now, I mean, if it's, as I mentioned, Voyage to Arcturus, if you're just going for the sort of over the top. But Patrick White's Riders in the Chariot.
I don't know it.
Oh.
It's good, huh? Okay.
Oh, mon petit.
I'm noting it down. Look.
No, look. Patrick White was the greatest Australian novelist of the 20th century. And you may say that's not necessarily the greatest of distinctions, but in fact it is a very high distinction because there is a wonderful Australian literary culture. And Patrick White is the most splendidly ungovernable force in that tradition, and the most titanic sort of creative figure in it. And Riders in the Chariot is his towering masterpiece.
All right, it's on my list.
And the imagery, I mean, it also uses Kabbalistic imagery. The image, obviously, of the chariot is the Merkaba of God as seen, as you know, seen by Ezekiel. And this vision of the divine chariot is shared by four different characters in the novel.
Cherubic characters.
And they become, of course, well, actually, the literal translation of the Kabbalistic phrase would be descenders into the chariot, those who go down it, but it
even better
to ride in it, yeah. I heart now.
I'm putting it on my list. It's there.
It's a gigantic novel, but make your students read it.
I will. I was curious. Are you familiar with? And I thought of this.
The answer must be yes.
Well, it must be yes. I was thinking about this with Kenagaya, about with Herbert Read's The Green Child. It's a very short novel.
Oh, of course, yeah. Oh, yeah.
As a kind of, I mean, I don't know that Read was explicitly, Gnostic or otherwise with any of this, but that book is such a
I mean, you know,
treatment of this sense of so many of these things involve transcending the flesh, and I love that it's about enmattering. You get deeper and deeper into the matter.
Right. With him, of course. I mean, it's a kind of it's not unlike the sensibility of Yeats talking about Byzantium.
Yes, correct.
Of hammered gold and gold enameling, in a sense, wanting to know no more of the flesh, wanting no longer to be bound to a dying animal. Well, Read, there's this is sort of weird mysticism of the aesthetic in which the final liberation, of course, in The Green Child, is the main character is mineralized. I mean,
precisely.
He becomes as perfect as a gem, because he himself emerges. Oh, of course, I'm giving the ending away here. This is very irresponsible.
Right. Nevertheless, it should be read.
You know the medieval legend of the Green Children, right? That it's based on.
Yes.
Right. Well, Herbert Read's a fascinating, but if you have them read that, of course, also his work on what is art is a great insight into the sort of strange aestheticized, as you put it right, almost sort of mirror inversion of the Gnostic longing that you find there. But yeah, no, I mean, to me, it's again, it's like the elderly Yeats thinking, how much better to be the perfected work of art, which knows nothing of corruption and change, and taking Byzantium, not just the icons and the gold, but even the automata,
right,
for the emperor, right?
It's like the
images
owl.
of a kind of as a kind of transcendence.
Definitely, yes.
It should have occurred to me that Herbert Read would be somewhere in your sensibility. So, of course, now that reminds me. Of course, my favorite of Johnson's books, and I know Arc is the great visionary or text, it's sort of like his cantos.
Yeah.
But the Green Man, right?
Yeah. The book, The Green Man. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, which I think, I don't think he ever quite again captured the lyrical beauty of that volume in his later works. But yeah,
he was working at that point, and I think it's a culmination of this. I suppose what you would call the Poundian ideogrammic method, where it involves a lot of collage, and it's really it operates towards seeing things. So he really mastered the form at that point. And then as he transitions towards arc, he starts to become more interested in relating contradictions and paradoxes, or kind of having two thoughts, two visions at the same time, and trying to figure out a way to represent those. So the collage technique of the ideogrammic method really served him well in that regard. But you're right, he shifts into a different. I think of it. It's I guess a coinage. I think mode, that is manifestation of vision. He's just trying to figure it out. But you're right, there's a quality of,
let's change that to ophthalmodelic. You don't mind?
Yeah, let's do it. I like it.
I like it.
Perfect.
I just have this problem with mixing Greek and Latin roots.
Yeah, that's true. I don't because I'm a fool.
I mean, telephone is fine, but television is wrong. Of course,
the German word for the television? Fernseher.
Oh yes, a Fernseher. Yes, seen from far. Palantir, I believe, is the Tolkien.
That's right, exactly. There we go. Wouldn't it be great if we were watching the Palantir every night?
Yeah. Well, the television, but or automobile. I can't for some reason. I mean, this is stupid, of course, but I find it.
No, I like it. I like it. All right, so ophthalmodelic. Are we going with that?
Yeah. But I just wanted to say in Greek, of course, automobile is avtokinito. They make it all Greek, and that's in Kanagaya, all the engines you may recall are various forms of kineton.
Yeah, I love that.
Kineton and things. Because So anyway, I'm sorry, that was a stupid interruption.
No, that was good. And who would have really appreciated that would have been Ronald Johnson. He would have been happy with that conversation, that move.
It's I think that in a very real sense, let me just then move on to a different topic before we run out of time. Not that we can run out of time, because time is our servant.
That's
until it isn't.
till it is,
when it rears
and
up
it's
and
our
kills us.
archon.
Yeah. That I think the part of the appeal today of the Gnostic mythos, the reason it really has made a return, but not by the avenues perhaps that people who use the term polemically think it has, is I think the project of modernity itself invokes, in fact, in a sense, produces kind of Gnostic discontent. The project of modernity, I mean, we can start with just the triumph of the mechanistic philosophy as a scientific method, but we know that it became the tacit metaphysics of modernity.
Yes.
That reality is material, it's mechanistic. We've chased away all the spirits, all the vital intelligences that once inhabited nature. But more than that, there's been a constant project, not only at the level of the ideology of the sciences, but in the way in which that ideology has corrupted the humanities or corrupted the study of humane things, like the political, the social, what we call anthropology, the human. These have become sciences in the sense that we're trying to impose upon them a model that itself began as a curiously defective model for inductive reasoning in early modernity, right? And this has become actually a project. I mean, we believe that we inhabit a natural world that is simply nothing but an exchange of mechanical forces and we have constructed a social and economic reality on that basis.
Absolutely.
And then integrated ourselves into it progressively. We've learned to treat even our humanity as a technology. That is, we've treated it as a political technology, as an economic technology. I mean, the great the great weakness of Marxism in its theoretical genesis was actually believing in the myth of Homo economicus to a degree of credulity. Not in the early Marx is very much something more of a romantic trying to escape this, but I mean, to my mind, clearly trying to escape it in ways that become impossible the more you grant the materialist premise of the dialectic. But now, we people happily thinking that humanity is a technology at the genetic level, the molecular level, the alter. And of course, every age has its special evils, but or a racial technology. I mean, again, the idea of race, of races, as opposed to the just notion of different peoples, but the notion of race as a biological designation is, basically an 18th century invention.
Yeah.
And the notion of racial technology, of eugenics, of the philosophy of the Reich. We know what the evils of modernity are. That if humanity is a technology, that invites us to correct it. Because if something's wrong with a machine,
fix it.
It needs to be adjusted or updated or perfected.
Yeah.
And so trying to say instead, no, I'm, within the appearance of the machine, within the social, the economic, the cultural, but also the physical machine to which you've confined my humanity. No, actually, that divine spark, that sacred place within, which is inviolable, a place where only God or the gods are to be welcomed.
Yes.
That, that part, that my true myself within myself, has to rebel against this. This world, this machine, into which, and of course, now with the internet more and more, we are becoming servants of the algorithm.
Oh, yes.
The Gnostic mythos suddenly has power and a clarity
Yes.
that is almost urgent, not merely attractive, but
yes.
that some kind of Gnostic rebellion against the moment in which we find ourselves is a necessary spiritual hygiene to recover that, and for Christians to recover that dimension of early Christianity, that Pauline sense or Johannine sense of being trapped within a false reality that has been invaded by one who loved the poor rather than the rich, and who loved community and the breaking of bread
yes.
better than the wielding of power, and who came to tell you that you're really the children of God.
And thrilled at the imagination of those things, that
yes,
they're palpably thrilled
yeah,
to be envisioning these things.
Oh, I mean, we have, I mean, the sort of, as much, when I rail against the physicalist reductionism of consciousness, I'm finally going to get my book on the philosophy of mind out, which has been delayed mostly just because I'm dilatory, believe it or not. People think that because I'm prolific, I'm energetic. I'm not. I'm prolific because I'm lazy. And so I'm writing, what's passing through my mind. But that, as much as I rail against that on just theoretical grounds, that it's logically and empirically nonsensical.
Yes.
That, I mean, you have to be, well, I mean, Daniel Dennett.
Yeah, I was waiting. I was waiting.
Intelligent. Well, I mean, is there anything more depressing than the example of Daniel Dennett, a man that intelligent who has devoted his life to defending and promoting such incredibly self-evidently stupid arguments? I mean, you really have to be a true believer.
Yeah.
I mean, because he's not a fool. I mean, he can absorb a great deal of information. I think he misunderstands at times. I mean, he's horrible when he tries to make sense of. I was just reading him yesterday on Brentano on intentionality, and he clearly doesn't understand at all what he's reading. But that's just because of a lack of sympathy. But I mean, the arguments he's made on the nature of consciousness and its reducibility to physicality, rank among the stupidest. And I agree with Cicero. There's nothing so absurd that some philosopher somewhere has not proposed it. I mean, that's what philosophers do. But he's taking it to an extremist extreme. It's just
extreme sport version of it. Interestingly,
but as much as I rail against that, at the logical level, at the philosophical level, it's so easy to pull apart. I mean, consciousness cannot be reduced.
No.
According to at least physicalism within either the mechanist or even some of the revised, panpsychists, or it cannot be done. That is the wrong answer, and that can be demonstrated copiously. That's not the problem. It's just how very destructive a falsehood it is.
Yeah.
It's simply the final.
Right.
It's the final. It's philosophy accommodating itself to something that at base is fairly evil.
Yes,
the mechanization of nature, the mechanization of humanity. It is the philosophical complement of pure capitalism, pure, in another sense, nihilism. It's destroying the world. It's destroying the soul. And it's just not true. I mean, it cannot be true. I mean, at the purest level of just elementary logic, it's nothing but a willful imposition of an incredible picture of reality over a world that's dying from that falsehood.
Right. I agree with you completely on that count. And when I started to, in an amateur way, study consciousness, from all different angles, and I was doing it as a dilettante, not with any sort of systematic quality whatsoever. That is. It's all of that exploration that led me into what became phosphorescence of thought, and that specifically in the midst of my readings and researches, when I encountered Dennett's ideas, I couldn't believe it. And I readily admit I have no real abilities when it comes to thinking philosophically. I mean, I know what I like, but I can't explain an argument. But boy, I got to that and I thought, this is not possible. No way. And so, and it totally informed how I wanted to engage that topic in any case, which was coming.
Is you don't need to be philosophically adroit to know that Dennett's wrong. You just have to be immune to obfuscation. When someone tells you that what you take to be qualitative consciousness isn't really there, it's that you just think that because you've made a third person report, your faculties make a third person report to you that convinces you that you're conscious. Okay.
Yeah.
This being the heterophenomenological
right
analysis that he offered. You don't need to be a brilliant philosopher to know that this is nonsense. You really don't.
That I am not, but I could tell. I was like, it's not true. It's not.
Yeah, that's not true. That one we know is
Or like there's the thermostats taking on, like property of consciousness. And
well, panpsychism is a different matter there, or not panpsychism. I mean, that in a sense, I mean the thermostat thing.
It's because as I recall, I remember John Searle really just like going after Dennett on that.
Well, the thing about John Searle, of course, is he's every bit as wrong as Dennett, but he's just not as absurd.
He's not as absurd, which was helpful for me in learning the landscape. It just provided me.
But if you think about it, is that they're a perfect complementary pair, except of course that Searle conducted himself like an adult and Dennett didn't. And doesn't. But, quite apart from that, what was interesting is that Searle, on the one hand, recognized the absurdity of functionalism and that this is just a different form of dualism and one that doesn't even make sense because the Chinese room argument is perfectly good in itself, but actually his later arguments are even better. The Chinese room arguments deceiving because that suggests that even without a semantics, there's a syntax in a kind of function, and that's wrong too. So on the one hand, Searle recognizes that this kind of functionalism, this notion of multiple realizability and thinking of thought as a kind of computer code or computationalism is just absurd and it can be torn apart easily. So of course he thinks of consciousness more in terms of a kind of physiological function that we just don't understand yet. But you see, Dennett, on the other hand, recognizes that that's absurd correctly, because he sees that's a kind of strange emergentism that doesn't have any logic in it. You're making consciousness real, and you're making it a physiological function that nonetheless can't possibly be assimilated to the kind of physical language of mechanism, or not that he'd call it mechanism now, but the picture of matter that he wants to promote, which is very much sort of on the one hand Darwinian gradualism combined with mechanism. On the other hand, it's when it comes to mind, it's a combination of functionalism, behaviorism, nativism. So each one recognizes that the other one is proposing something that doesn't make sense, without recognizing that his own propositions are equally absurd.
Yeah.
But Searle's not quite as absurd as Dennett. I mean, Dennett, and the point when Searle says, "Okay, pinch yourself. Did you feel that? All right." Yeah. So conscious, it's
something at least.
There is someone to whom that consciousness is appearing as subjectivity.
whose approach are you most interested in the
My
terms
own.
of that of course is the most interesting one we could be
Uh,
talking about, but after that, what just
oh,
curious because it was a field that I spent some time really exploring. I haven't kept up with it in any way, but I'm just curious, where do you see the kind of interesting notions lying? Is it from like
well,
the
I don't want to give too much aid and comfort to the Thomists here, but I think there's some neo-Aristotelian approaches which are helpful. But in the end of the day, uh, I would say it'd be a combination of various figures, people like Stephen R. L. Clark, who just
okay,
writes essays on the issue, um, Owen Barfield,
okay.
though I don't agree with his understanding of the history of the development of consciousness. But the truth is, I mean, I have my own special set of concerns,
Mhm.
and in the book that I'm finishing up now, I more or less argue that mind, life, and language are all one and the same phenomenon. So
Okay, I like that.
and
Yes, I'm that
I mean,
aligns.
there are many very enlightening writers on the issue. Even the people I disagree. I like David Chalmers, though I disagree with his
Yes, I do
conclusions.
too.
But there's a richness of reflection there that
Agreed.
incredibly lively mind. That's not
Yes,
yeah.
agreed.
And part of it is I get the honest feeling he's trying to get the right answers rather than to promote the vision of reality he prefers.
Yes, yeah, that's one sense is that for sure.
Um, I think you know I think when approaching an understanding of actual conscious agency of what the mind does, that the analytic tradition has been something of a disaster
Hmm.
thinking about mind. And most philosophy of mind is written by Anglophone philosophers these days.
Hmm.
And the result, I mean, I think part of it is just the sort of credulous belief in the superstition of analysis. That analysis is the correct way of understanding analysis without synthetic aspiration. The notion that you can, if you have a complex proposition, you want to break it down into as many discrete propositions that are as near to analytically true as possible. So
Hmm.
you're making a constant sort of descent towards tautology. This involves, however, presuming a kind of univocity of terms that's impossible. Language can't do that.
Mm.
Conflating the ideas of different ages and of different traditions as if using the same word means that it covers the same conceptual topology, which is absurd. But also the notion that you can understand something only by decomposition. Well, that means you've already decided in advance that, in a sense, it's a mechanistic or a composite or a physical reality you're dealing with.
Hmm.
In analytic philosophy, you get these like, consciousness is one thing, intentionality another, unity, but that's not true. And so the continental tradition is superior in this regard. I mean, when Husserl
Hmm.
undertakes to understand what the act of mind is in regard to knowing the world or knowing at least what it intends to know,
Yes.
it's an examination of the integrity of the act and the way in which it's inseparable. If you think for instance, Dennett, Searle, one thing they'd agree on is that consciousness just sense qualia. It's just sensation, and it doesn't have an intentional content. And intentionality means propositional content. And this is such an impoverishment of both. And then the idea is, well, if you can explain one, the other will fall into place. As you know,
Mhm.
having it function within the larger system. And so, and here I even disagree with, I do disagree with Chalmers that when he says that consciousness, and he means it isolating it in this sense, generally he means it, is the hard problem. No, it's just one hard problem.
I see. Yeah.
Intentionality is a hard problem as well. And in fact, they turn out to be one and the same problem
Mhm.
because you can't have consciousness without intentionality or intentionality without consciousness, and both together are the irreducible mark of the mental, as is unity of apprehension, as and this is part of intentionality, the teleology of consciousness, and
Mhm.
any number of other things. So I can't recommend any one philosopher in general. I can say, though, that I think that the phenomenological tradition is a necessary corrective to the incredible sterilities that a lot of analytic philosophy of mind
Mm.
cultivate. And also, I found it very useful to go to a lot of Indian sources.
Mhm. Yes, yes. Yeah, that I'm not surprised.
Lately, I've been reading a great deal of Kashmiri Shaivism on just this issue of the Sakshin,
Mm.
the witness, the ground of subjectivity, that or Atman, and its irreducibility. And I find that centuries before Western philosophy was addressing any of this, there were Indian reflections on being aware of being aware that are
Mhm.
incredibly sophisticated. And if we didn't suffer from sort of condescending prejudice towards those sources, we have a lot to learn from them.
Mm. What about poetry? Is there any poetry that you feel is a kind of a mirror to mind, mirror to the
Oh, in
not just
general,
consciousness, but yeah,
I believe it's a far more lucid mirror in many ways. It's just
yeah.
in a more, but again, in the mode of participation, which
Okay.
isn't how, which makes it rather difficult to use for dialectic. Someone who is good at this, though, is Stephen R. L. Clark. I mentioned him earlier. You can pick up
Yeah.
his books, and they're
Hmm.
just filled with quotations, in which he integrates poetic insight into philosophical argument with considerable virtuosity.
Okay. That's a useful tip. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking especially of someone like Emily Dickinson, whose
Uh,
poems have these they don't prove or even clarify anything. They just simply demonstrate. They have this
can,
quality of showing in the kind of Julian of Norwich sense. This like
can I make a confession here? No, this is just between you and me.
and the world.
Right. Orbis non sufficit. I mean, I think that was the motto on the escutcheon of James Bond's family. The I hate Emily Dickinson.
Oh,
I'm
interesting.
sorry. She's
Yeah, yeah,
I,
yeah.
I'm one of the Dickinson doubters.
Mm,
I
mm.
think most of her most celebrated verse is doggerel, but it could just be that I'm tone deaf. There are always these figures that some of us
Hmm.
are tone deaf to.
Blind spot.
Hmm?
I say it's like a blind spot.
I kind of like to think that it's especially penetrating vision, but you might be right. It might be a blind spot.
Yeah.
I'm just I'm not a Dickinson admirer.
What about Whitman then?
I like Whitman better, but
Yeah.
even then, if I were to choose my favorite 19th century American poets, they would be like Melville at his
Yes.
best,
Yeah.
Jones Very at his best,
Yes.
even Emerson. I would put them all ahead of both Whitman and Dickinson.
Yeah. A little frolic
Uh,
architecture never did anyone
right.
harm. Yeah.
And I confess this, thinking I'm a traitor to my people. There are others who share my doubts about the Bell of Amherst. I'll point out. I mean, it's not there's not a lot of. I put it. not a lot of verbal genius in those. Anyway, that's a different issue. Look,
Yeah,
before we
that would be
finish,
a whole other conversation. Yeah, I
yeah,
would have to.
and I've already said more than I ought to. I'll have scandalized those who love her. I do my best, to. And of course, it often happens that I go back when and reread someone I've always disliked in the past and suddenly find myself liking them.
Yes, yeah, that's
So none of these judgments are absolute until, of course, I reach the grave, at which point, retractions become difficult. Um, but yeah. Uh, but let's just talk about the Sampo before we
yeah,
back off,
yeah.
because this is
I'd love to.
your I don't know if I call it your epic. It's your
It's an Epilion. It's a pocket epic.
yeah, right. Or a casting of the runes in a sense, because there are 50 runes in the Kalevala, and you choose a certain number of them to turn into. Well, first of all, you're not Finnish, are you?
Yeah, the on my mother's side. So
Oh,
my
okay.
mother's father
Of course,
was,
of course. I mean, O'Leary is such a
yeah, it's like, all right. My mother's
O'Banian,
father
right?
was born in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in Hancock, which is all the way up in Keweenaw County, where there's a substantial Finnish population, and he was the only, I believe, I'm telling this
Irish
accurately.
interloper.
No, he was the only of seven siblings born in the United States. All of his other siblings were born in Finland. So they emigrated over to work in the copper mines, and he ended up down in Detroit, which is where my mom grew up, and met my mom's mother when he began working for my great grandfather's tool and die shop. So so yeah, so on my mom's side, they're um, assimilated, secularized Jews on one side of her family and Finns on the other, and my dad, they were Irish Catholics. So there is, so this was definitely a kind of a homecoming recovery rediscovery thing that happened with the Sampo.
Well, how would you describe? I've been describing it, but you're the actual poet, so how would you describe it too?
Um, it is I think of it as a recasting of the passages in the Sampo that are related to, or the passages in the Kalevala that are related to the Sampo itself. So that became the focal
And the
object.
Sampo, of course, is this object that confers fortune and wealth.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it was I was attracted to it for a couple of reasons. One of them was subordinate to a greater reason. The subordinate reason was I just I have a great love for R. Gordon Wasson's book Soma, the Divine Mushroom of Immortality. It's, I think, one of the great daffy, beautiful
Okay. Yes. Yes.
books.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just an amazing book. And in one of the appendices in that book, he points out that based on this sort of etymological spore that he's following, that the Sampo, there's a way in which it could be a mushroom, and so that became just appealingly weird to me. But the larger attraction, the larger connection was um, not coincidentally through this avenue of fantasy. Specifically, there are these glorious illustrations of scenes from the Kalevala that are done by the great Finnish secessionist Art Nouveau artist named Akseli Galen Kalila,
Yep.
and And when my family and I were in Helsinki a decade or so ago, we went to the National Museum, which is this sort of 19th century structure in the style of Romantic nationalism. And in the center, the sort of atrium of the museum, there are these glorious frescoes painted by Galen Kalila, depicting 4 scenes from the Sampo. They're in the pendentives, which are the sort of fluted triangular things under the dome. And I had
I believe, though, that first of all, thank you for explaining what pendentives are, but I rely on the listeners to look these things up. If they didn't.
Sorry, okay.
So we're now going to change that to spandrels. Same thing, everybody, pendentives and spandrels. I know. I've been in that museum. I'm actually, though, I mean, it's since you mentioned it, though, Romantic nationalism, of course, the reason I bring it up, I was going to ask you before we go if there was a passage of something of yours you might want to read, maybe even something from the Sampo, but if not.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's interesting to me, the Kalevala in general, what Lönnrot was doing when he created it, because of course on the one hand he's drawing on real materials, he's compiling. On the other side, it's a synthetic work. He's writing his own national epic, and so this means somewhat rearranging some of the myths. I mean,
yes, absolutely.
Some of the heroic myths that belong to other heroes now get assimilated into the story of Lemminkainen.
Yes.
Actually, my favorite parts of the Kalevala have to do with Lemminkainen, and he's one of those mythic heroes who descends to the world of the dead in one episode, of course, in Tuonela, and all that. But it is the period of national myth, right? I mean, it's this part of the other side. It has both. There are 2 ways in which you can think about it, you know, and I mean, I include in this not just a work that at once is reconstructive and creative, like the Kalevala, but the renewed interest in national epics, like, you know, the Eddas, or or the Mabinogion.
Right.
And so on and so forth, or the creation of a fake mythic past in someone like Ossian, or the Celtic twilight fascination with Taliesin and all else. On the one hand,
yes,
there is the romantic longing for re-enchantment there that we were talking about earlier. It's also, though, I mean, part of, there's a dark side to it too, in the sense that you're not just trying to re-enchant the world, you're trying to re-enchant blood and soil in some sense.
Yes, right.
They're trying to, the nation state is the most artificial of modern human institutions, because unlike, say, empires, which are just, realms of power and commerce under a kind of military supervision.
Yes.
Is that empires have no problem with pluralism, right? I mean, the nation state's something different because
it likes to exclude.
Right. It's exclusive. It has to create, but it's not just excluding what's outside it. It's homogenizing what's within it.
Definitely.
It creates the myth of a natural unity that somehow corresponds to the boundaries drawn on a map.
Definitely.
So Italy, to become a nation, has to exterminate a lot of its different dialects. There's this forced conformity, and part of that is the longing for a shared mythology of the nation, of the people who belong here in this place.
Yes. Yeah.
And I have to say, I didn't even mean to address this, so forgive me for bringing up, but it is something that I'm conscious of. On the one hand, I'm fascinated with all of these works. I'm fascinated with the longing,
yes,
to find the mythic materials and bring them into the present. On the other hand, I'm also aware of let's be honest. I mean, uh, those Nazi parades
Right.
in which people were dressed like figures from the Volsung saga or something.
Right. Right. Exactly. It's got the Wagnerism,
Yeah,
the the
and so I mean,
pitfalls of that for sure.
as much as I love the Kalevala, I'm also aware of there's kind of the tragedy of creating and trying to create a mythology.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, even in a sense, like the Lord of the Rings, and all that.
Right.
Tolkien is
Right.
trying to
Right.
create
Which was also drawing from the same well.
yeah, yeah. Not
Yeah.
not that his politics were anything like that. Don't get me
No,
wrong.
no,
And he
but in
wasn't.
terms of the longing and also in terms of the material, obviously. I
Yeah,
mean, there's the interesting too, Lönnrot was this district health officer,
yeah,
and that's what allowed him to travel all around, the Finnish speaking world, and he located Karelia, which is sort of north central and it shares regional border with Russia. He chose that as the place where he felt that this was the source from which all of these streams flowed. But he himself was, I mean, his name is Swedish, so
yeah. Well, I mean,
you're aware that he's part of this other, the fact that it's already a kind of polyglot
yeah. Well,
reality in its way.
the patrician class, the educated class of Finland, was basically more Swedish
For
speaking than
Swedes, yeah,
Finnish. So, I
for
mean,
sure.
think about this, the Sibelius, the great
Alias.
Finnish composer, and
It's a great Swedish name.
never really mastered Finnish. He
No,
was more comfortable speaking Swedish.
yeah, yeah,
So, but I mean, and of course, this is not limited just to the age of the rise of the European nation state. It seems
yeah,
to be part of the recurrent story of trying to mythologize the ethos, of make the nation state seem like something rooted in dim antiquity rather than
yes,
an ideological, economic, political, military construct of the modern age.
yes,
Hindutva,
yeah, right, right.
this
You
right
see
wing
that there.
nationalist, has gone hand in hand with this insistence on there being one correct orthodox text of the Ramayana and of the
Right.
Mahabharata. So
Yeah.
it is, and to insist that the Mahabharatan material goes back to that there wasn't a migration of the so-called Arya, the Aryan people,
Right. Right.
the Perso-Indians into northern India, and that in fact that
Yes.
this is as much native to this soil, this blood is as native to the soil as is the Dravidian, so it's a common thing. I went off on a tangent. Sorry about that.
No,
So,
no,
having
it's there.
darkened the waters here, is there something you'd like to read? Would you?
Sure. Why don't I? I'll just read the opening. I'm not gonna. I'll just read the first few pages. They go fast, and I can kind of put things in a little bit of context, which is,
And I believe that when the Sampo came out, you got a nice letter of congratulations or appreciation from Ursula K. Le Guin.
I did. Yeah, a
Okay.
treasure, a treasure. I sent her a copy, and it was shortly before she died, and
Yeah.
she very sweetly responded. Yeah.
Okay.
And I also sent it to the Finnish ambassador to the United States. I thought, why not? And unsurprisingly, I believe she's an economist, or at least she was the person who was ambassador at the time. I received a response from her, which was also really terrific, where uh, she said, "I congratulate you on making a great work of art." And then she went through and said, the Kalevala has been a great source for Finnish art for many decades. It was just really nice. Like the
Well,
economists.
you could argue that the Kalevala, in one sense, was the creation
Yeah,
also of
that's true.
Finnish.
I didn't say that when I sent it to
Yeah.
the ambassador. I was just hoping for a little
Well, they
little
didn't have a
reply.
noteworthy Baroque period, did they? I
No,
mean,
no, precisely.
every nation has its moments and
Yeah,
of ascendancy and decline. So,
they do. Well, so the Kalevala, as recorded by Lönnrot and compiled by him, is written in trochaic tetrameter. So think Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And that aligns with the rhythmical propensities in Finnish, which tend to go with trochees. So Vainamoinen, da 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 da. And it fits very well. So Vana Vaha Vainamoinen. That's a repeated line throughout. Yeah, which means old and steadfast Vainamoinen. In any case, I didn't reproduce any of the rhythms at all. I was interested in using a technique of what I called imagist epic. Specifically, I wanted to use these flashing images, and I also restricted myself from using verbs. I would use participial phrases, but I wouldn't complete them, and I wanted to use the period as a punctuation mark. It's almost like creating cells in a strip of animation, like in an animated film. So each phrase functions like a cell, and then it flows together to create the animated image. So that's just an orientation to the language as a way of potentially hearing. And it just starts with the scene of Vainamoinen making his way through these snowy fields from the north. He's gone to the north to try to either find or convince the witch of the north to make a new Sampo, and he's come back to the south of Finland, where it's a little bit warmer and there are birch trees. So it's not just fir trees. And the birch has this it's a sacred wood for Vainamoinen, and takes on that property as well. So I'll just read the opening couple of pages here. Okay.
All right.
So this is the beginning of Forging the Sampo, which is the first section of the pocket epic, the Epyllion. To forge, to forage, to forge, the boreal forest, icing on the fronds of pines, snow loads caught at the cores of trees, hovering winter sun, pale. It's approaching midday hiatus, reindeer, his horse, motifs woven on its harness, rhymed, tinkle of the bells, absorbed by the snowy fields, hiss of his sledge, cutting birchwood runners, deerskins, elk's antlers, clean cold he rolls through, and there, at last, a birch tree, stripped of leaves, mycophoric birch, branches witching outward. This specimen, sorcery's northmost sign, polished wedge of wood rubbed smoother still, birch, koivu. In his pocket, talismanic sympath of the southerly woods, his power, Vainamoinen, sighing, talking. Wolves devour wizards, disease fells fenny, easily as trees. You'll never make it, so they said, doomed journey. Neither tooth of wolf nor claw of frost assailed me. Blessed birch, ramifying underground, shining moonlight. It's only afternoon, pluming breath, his mirth, his mustaches sodden, from breathing heavily, the wood's cool blue doom. Moon like a torch fuse, moon like a redolence of life, a force, a smear, Vainamoinen. Feeling at his feet earthen powers, Vainamoinen, an incitation, a feeling of the turning world, an opening in the grove, spied there, sudden cratophanic onset, sense of instant forces issuing into him, singing. So that's the opening verses there. Vainamoinen, of course, is your readers will, or your viewers will want to look him up, but he's the wizard, the sort of wizard figure of the poem. Koivu is the Finnish word for birch. I think that's probably useful annotation. Useful enough. I won't add any more.
I was hoping you would do the Robert Bly thing and dance for us.
yeah. I the first time I performed, I did a performance of this. It was at a gallery here in Chicago, and I have a friend. He's a Franciscan who plays the harp, and he improvised, and I have this kind of shamanic robe that I was wearing.
That might be overdoing it.
Oh, we went to the top and then we went over the top. That was
right.
That was
sometimes you just have to.
Yes, you
well,
do.
Listen, I think a reading is a good place to stop. So I'm going to say it's been a pleasure speaking. I'm going to stop the recording before I sign off with you, but I will stop the recording now and say
I've enjoyed it immensely, David. Thank you for inviting me to come talk to you.
And he did too.
Good.
He's you can see.
I can see his disposition hasn't necessarily changed, but I feel gratified by his presence.
There was one thing I wanted, before we go, I guess I should point out to those who don't know that the difference between an Asian and a European dragon is significant. Yes, Asian dragons keep to the heavens for the most part, and they are images of vitality and wisdom, beneficence quite often. European dragons like cold and dark places and cling to their treasures and like things that shine in the dark and will kill to preserve them. They're far and away much more saturnine and devious creatures. But that said, they both make good pets.
That's right. That's
Take care.
Good. Yes. Thank you.